Qasim Rashid, great to have you for a couple minutes here on the show. I appreciate you making time. There's so much happening right now with the whole Trump administration. I'm calling them the regime, frankly. Watching Trump sign a record amount of executive orders, Elon Musk doing what appears to be, we'll put it politely, a Nazi salute, although I have other language for that. And now we're seeing... Yeah, twice. Thank you. And now we're seeing this widespread attempt to quote unquote deport the illegals. And you are a human rights lawyer. I want you to introduce yourself briefly to my audience, and I have a few questions to ask you about that particular issue, the deportations that we're seeing happening in Miami, in Newark, New Jersey, my own state, Chicago, etc.
Yeah, my name is Qasim Rashid. I'm a Chicago-based human rights attorney. I'm an immigrant to this country. And since starting my practice of law about 15 years ago now, I've worked on, I don't know how many asylum cases, refugee cases. This has kind of been my pro bono work primarily over the last decade and a half. And so I know this stuff fairly well. What we're seeing right now is unprecedented in modern American history. And I say modern American history because we've seen this before. We saw this with the anti-Asian attacks in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We saw this with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Asiatic Exclusion League. We saw this with the Executive Order 9066 that took 100,000 Japanese Americans and put them into concentration camps. And the irony of all of this is that we fought World War II to liberate Europe from fascism. And right now, the Trump regime is building out a similar model. I often remind folks that there's a great book written by Professor Quincy of Princeton University called Hitler's American Model, where in his rise to power, he sent his lawyers to the United States. Why? Because the United States had Jim Crow laws, and he was interested in separating races and making sure that races stayed separate. And what's, I think, the most mortifying thing about this book is that Hitler's lawyers came back to Germany and said, look, we might be Nazis, but we are not Americans. We got to slow it down. These guys are crazy over there. They thought the Jim Crow laws were too extreme to implement. That's how bad it was. And so you look at where he got his inspiration from. It was from this fascism that we had here in the United States. And in many ways, Trump is trying to revive that fascism. And we can get into the specifics, but I want to be very clear. The worst mistake we can make right now is underestimate his extremism, because that's how fascism thrives.
Yeah, let's talk about that briefly. You keep on dropping the F word, fascism. And to be frank, I'm all about calling things what they are. And I also know that we are facing a very powerfully funded right-wing media ecosystem that's really good at propaganda. They've done a good job of convincing people that saying fascist is so extreme. It's like saying Nazi. So from where you stand, knowing what you know in your own work as a human rights lawyer, why do you use that word fascist or fascism, and how do you define it briefly?
Well, I use it because if it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it's a duck. And we can look up the textbook definition of fascism. It's everything from trying to enforce a religion, trying to enforce ethnic superiority, the power of force. We can get into that textbook definition, but here's where I know this is driven by fascism and white supremacy. I'll give you just a couple of examples. The argument is, well, we're not anti-immigrant, we're anti-illegal immigrant.
Right.
Well, that ignores a couple of critical things. It ignores that the definition of what's an illegal immigrant has changed throughout American history arbitrarily to whatever the people in power want. From post-Civil War to 1930, 1940 or so, about 50 million mostly undocumented white European immigrants came to the United States. Donald Trump's own ancestors were undocumented immigrants. Stephen Miller's own ancestors were undocumented immigrants. And that was not considered illegal immigration. That's just the way it was. In fact, and Dr. King talks about this, these are folks who came here undocumented and got about 270 million acres of land through the Homestead Act. That was considered legal. Meanwhile, enslaved black people who had just finally been liberated from private slavery got nothing, didn't get their 40 acres and a mule. Next, you have this concept of quotas. You have this concept of the 1965 Immigration Nationalism Act. It helped improve the immigration process. But now you also had asylum. And asylum is legal immigration. Donald Trump is now trying to ban asylum altogether and
Right.
making up rules about a port of entry or a third country requirement. It's all nonsense, right? The way you apply for asylum legally, and this is on the USICS website, is you enter the country by any means necessary and you apply for asylum and your case is heard. And there's a specific set of facts that you have to hit before you can be approved for asylum. But it is legal immigration. 1,660 Afghan refugees had been vetted through the legal process by the US government. These are refugees, by the way, who had helped us against the Taliban, which is a terrorist organization. That helped us with translations, that helped us by finding the mastermind heads of this organization. They had put their own lives at risk, and they had been vetted through the entire refugee process, which if I showed you the flow chart, it's like 27 steps. As they were on the plane to come here, Donald Trump blocked them and said, nope, you're not coming here. So here are 3 examples I've just given of immigrants who are legal,
Yep.
but suddenly, because they're of color, they can't come here anymore. They're gone. They're done.
Right. Right.
DACA is legal immigration now, and he's trying to ban that as well. Now, on the flip side, right now there are about 500,000, some estimates as high as 600,000 undocumented Canadian and European immigrants in the United States. How many examples can you cite of ICE raiding a majority white school to go after these kids? How many examples can you cite of ICE separating a white family from their white babies and throwing them in cages? You can't. The target, when was the last time Trump said, let's build a wall in Canada because there's, hundreds of thousands of undocumented, illegals from Canada coming in? It's not happening.
Right.
And so every example we see is upholding a system of white supremacy. White immigrants are great. He's even said it. We need more immigrants from Norway and Sweden, and we need less from those asshole countries like Haiti and Africa. So he's telling us this is about white supremacy. We should believe him and not whitewash it.
Well, I mean, you said a lot of great things there. A couple of things that I think are worth picking up on. Number one, in regards to the Afghani refugees who have come over here, who have worked with the United States, right, against really their in some ways the Taliban might see it as like their own people, right? If they have to go back there to Afghanistan, they're going to be obviously targeted, right, very intentionally for working with the so-called enemy, right? So what Trump has done right there is just, it's unconscionable to those people who, as part of the agreement, said, hey, if we work with you and help you out, can we get access or get asylum in the United States? So that's worth pointing out for sure. I also think it's really worth talking about exactly the last part, that there's a reason why when almost anyone, whether they're progressive or conservative or whatever, when they hear the word immigrant or undocumented immigrant or illegal immigrant, they have a certain version of what that person looks like in their mind. And it's for, I'm going to guess, for 99% of the people, including myself, frankly, it's not someone with blonde hair and blue eyes who's super white looking, right? I have a different vision in my head of what this person looks like. And once again, what we're seeing is the effective nature of propaganda pushed from the right-wing media ecosystem, which unfortunately for me and our audience are largely Christian. So much of this is being done in the name of the Christian God, right? Now, you are Muslim, I am Christian. You and I have talked before about our faiths and how our faith leads us to liberation, not to oppression. But we also are aware how either of our faith traditions, in particular mine in America, can become quite oppressive and uphold what you, I think, rightfully called is a white supremacist view, where we have to protect our country from the invaders, quote unquote, who don't look like us, but welcome in the people who look like us. Perhaps one example that is just so glaring is the fact that at one point Elon Musk was not a legal immigrant. He was here, quote unquote, illegally, working illegally. And Trump and Charlie Kirk and all those folks don't think that he's some terrible person who broke the rules. They celebrate the work that Elon Musk is doing. So I think that is really, really important to call out.
In addition to those eloquent comments, the evidence repeatedly shows that when an immigrant or immigrants, whether they're undocumented or documented, are in a community, that community statistically has lower crime. It statistically has higher levels of safety. It statistically has higher levels of vaccination and lower disease and illness. It statistically has more small businesses, more entrepreneurs. Immigrants are paying hundreds of billions in taxes every year, and undocumented immigrants are as well, and getting no actual economic benefit. These are all arguments that are facts. This is not an opinion. Northwestern University did a 150-year study on this and found that at no point in the last 150 years have immigrants or undocumented immigrants had higher crime rates than U.S. citizens. And let me also make one point that the right always brings up, that, well, if you're illegal, you're by definition a criminal. That's just not true. Words matter. Words have meanings. Yep. Undocumented immigration is the same as a civil violation. It's like getting a parking ticket or a speeding ticket. So if you want to say, hey, I got caught going 13 over in a residential zone, I'm a criminal, I need to be deported, that's insane to me. That's mind-boggling to me. And what's a shame is this new fascist act, the Lake and Riley Act, effectively does that. On the mere accusation that somebody committed theft, we're deporting people. It doesn't make any sense. It's contrary to common sense. It's contrary to compassion. It's contrary to the due process of law that our Constitution requires, which, by the way, applies to undocumented immigrants as well. The Supreme Court has ruled on this repeatedly. And I think the key point I want folks to understand, and I'll close my rant with this point, is that these policies are not actually making America safer.
Right.
They're actually making us less safe, because look at what they did to these 1,600 some Afghan refugees. Do you think the next time the United States needs an ally to work with our soldiers or work with our civil service in another country, you think they're going to work with us? Hell no. They're going to say, look, we saw what you did to the Afghans. We saw what you did to the Kurds, abandoning them. Why in the world would we trust our people to you? You go figure it out on your own. It makes us less safe. And that's just an asinine and stupid thing to do.
Well, not to mention some of these raids are catching actual U.S. citizens. There was a story in Newark, New Jersey of a raid that happened, and they were interrogating a man, by the way, with no warrant, who was doing nothing wrong, just existing, asking about his legal status, which, again, violates his constitutional rights. So it is amazing to see the effects, the real-world effects of really damaging propaganda that, unfortunately, in this country has been here before, and we're seeing it rear its ugly head. Again, unfortunately, in my case, in the name of Jesus, which is mind-blowing considering not only who Jesus was, himself someone who was under the boot of empire as a refugee, but also his teachings, and frankly, many places in the scripture command us to welcome the immigrant, welcome the alien, treat them as a citizen among you, etc. And it's very frustrating and angering to see my faith tradition read those passages, ignore them, and then create new theological justifications for why this is somehow a Christian position to hold. And again, to be clear, right, we're not talking about people who enter the country in any kind of way and do a lot of harm. Of course, you and I are never going to disagree on that. That people who do damage should be brought to justice. But as you said, the data is very clear. I think the Cato Institute echoes this. That in their studies, I believe in Texas, which is where this mantra really lives, they found that undocumented immigrants were half as likely to commit violent crimes compared to their native-born counterpart. And so if people were really focused on reducing crime, why wouldn't you be talking about all the white men doing school shootings, right? Or doing other kinds of violence? Well, because it's not really about the crime. It's about who's doing the crime and what we envision America to look like. I do want to get, unless you want to respond to that, I do want to get your thoughts on kind of a part two about on this conversation, but I'll give you time to respond.
I'll give it just a 10-second response for
Sure.
listeners. The Cato Institute is a right-leaning think tank as well. Tucker Carlson worked there if you want to know how conservative they are. and the George W. Bush Institute did a study and found the exact same thing. So we're not quoting liberal propaganda as people think this is. This has been found by left-leaning, by right-leaning, by independent think tanks. This is well-established fact. And if you're denying this fact, you're basically denying what's going to make us safer, and you're buying into racism, and it's going to make us less safe. And that's just, it's nonsensical for your children, for my children. I don't care what faith or religion or party you follow or don't follow. I want your children to be safe. That's just a fact. And we 100%. Need to follow the fact to make sure all of our children are safer.
I agree. Let me get your response to this. So I got this message from a friend who is pretty connected to some NGOs, non-governmental organizations, so nonprofit organizations who might work with the government to do certain things. And he mentioned this. I'm going to read the text out for people on podcast. And make sure, friends, that you subscribe to the channel for more content like this. In April, Joy and I, my co-host for Friday, we're going to be talking about the lack of empathy. In fact, what some Christians are now calling the sin of empathy. So we'll get into the theological side of this conversation later on this week. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel or the podcast. But my friend sent me this text message literally yesterday, and that's why I texted you. Let's get you on the show. Here's what he said. He said, Trump ordered that all the services for the refugees that are here need to stop. Not that you don't have funding, but that you have to stop helping them. This is just plain cruel. Here is the letter explaining it. Now, this is from World Relief. They are a conservative Christian organization. They literally kicked out a lawyer who offered to help them because he was married to a gay man. Okay, so this is not, to your point, Qasim, this is not some left-wing radical organization or something like that. Here's what it says. World Relief. At 3:45 p.m. on Friday, January 24th, we were notified that all government-funded activities serving almost 4,000 of our refugee clients here in the U.S. must cease effective immediately. This means families who have been promised refuge and life-saving services in our neighborhood and communities are now at risk of going hungry and homeless. Your donations are now the only way we can provide basic assistance in the form of food, shelter, transportation, and other essential support services. While we are still trying to grapple with the consequences of this order and urgently seeking further clarity from the government, one thing is clear, and this is in all bold. Together, we are now the only lifeline for the hundreds of families devastated by this announcement. So even this propaganda is even affecting the very people who might support Trump. Now, I don't know who voted for Trump or who didn't inside of World Relief. They're a huge organization, but they definitely skew more conservative and would not be surprised if many of them did. And here's the result of that. Now, the government is saying, hey, any of our money that we've given you to help people who are already here, who are seeking refuge or asylum, people who have no home to go back to, you cannot use that money to take care of their basic needs. So, I saw this, and then I saw this tweet, and this is a really good example, I think, of how what I'm calling state-run propaganda functions, because Charlie Kirk has been in the tank for Donald Trump since the beginning. He takes credit for helping get Trump elected. Him and Trump are very close. A lot of billionaires who are part of the Trump world give the Turning Point USA, etc. Charlie Kirk, 2 days later, tweets this out. I'm going to read this, Qasim, and then get your response to it.
Please.
He says, quote, allow me to explain how the government-sanctioned so-called refugee resettlement, quote, nonprofits really work. These are large companies that make more money from taxpayers the more refugees the government lets in. It's another cog in the mass migration racket. They build in margins for each refugee they resettle. So when we stop admitting people, so does their financing. This represents an existential crisis for them. So they misrepresent the scriptures, and they emotionally blackmail Americans on Sundays. I'll rephrase that. And they emotionally blackmail Americans on Sunday, and it shows on Sunday shows and in op-eds to gin up controversy and sob stories to game the refugee programs against our national interests. It's a financial racket that Trump just slammed shut. We will not be manipulated anymore. So Charlie's general thesis is, hey, groups like World Relief are just trying to make a ton of money off of refugees, and they're mad that their goose egg, their golden egg here, has been cut off. What is your response to something like this by Charlie?
So many. First, Matthew 7:22 and 23, and you know what that verse is, and I'm sure you'll talk about that on Friday as well. But I think that the two more contemporary points I would make is one, he doesn't buy his own argument, because this is the exact argument that we make regarding the private prison complex, the prison industrial complex, and the military industrial complex. And he will never buy into those. He goes, no, of course not. That's silly. It's silly to think that the private prison industry thrives on higher incarceration rates, targeting Black and brown communities, knowing full well that there are ample data sets, extensive proof and evidence that these private prison industries exist specifically to exploit Black and brown people and low-income white people. This is a fact. He will never admit that, but now suddenly that applies here to refugees. So one, he knows he's lying. And two, if he's going to start attacking even conservative Christians, then what he's telling us is that there is no possible scenario for him to listen to anybody that's going to change his worldview. And whoever challenges his worldview by saying, hey, look, here's actual evidence of the people that we're helping. Here are the people that we're feeding and clothing and nurturing and educating, which, by the way, Jesus Christ specifically taught. Like, it's not even a matter of interpretation. It's like very clearly, in no uncertain terms, taught this. If even that is causing you to say, no, I'm going to side with the billionaires over the refugees, who, by the way, most of these refugees are Christian themselves,
Yep.
then to me, that's the difference between research and propaganda. Research asks, what is the answer? And then you objectively search and find the answer. Propaganda says, I have the answer. Let me reallocate the data to make it look like that's the only possible answer. And so, notwithstanding that he doesn't buy his own argument, because this is the argument, the actual argument for the prison industrial complex. And if you look at books like The New Jim Crow by Dr. Michelle Alexander, and
Yes,
just
great book.
Of the number of people incarcerated, we are the most incarcerated country in the world. That argument applies. But to say that refugees and asylees and people desperately seeking safety from tyranny are somehow exploiting a system. And by the way, we can look at the data of where that money is going. It's very well documented. It's not like the Pentagon audit, which fails every single time. It's very well documented. The IRS is very quick. And I do this because I work with nonprofits on IRS filings for nonprofit organizations. The IRS will remove your tax exemption status, and you will go to jail if you steal from a charity, as Trump's children should know, because they're not allowed to operate charity because they were stealing from a cancer charity. And so the data is there. He's not looking at data. He's projecting by talking about an emotional appeal. He's the one who's actually making the fear-mongering appeal. The facts paint a very different picture. He doesn't want to address those facts, but we need to make clear that that what we're seeing right now is the height of cruelty, and it cannot be allowed to continue.
I completely agree with you on all points. I also want to add, and again, we are going to go into detail later on this week with me and April, so make sure, folks, that you're subscribed to the YouTube channel so you get notified when we go live this Thursday around noon. But also, it's interesting to watch Charlie and really this right-wing world once again demonstrate how they actually have no foundational values that drive them, because for the longest time, people like Charlie would say it's not the government's job to help people, it's the church's job, it's small business, it's the individual job. So here we have a nonprofit that's saying, hey, we as a non-government organization will actually help resettle refugees that are here through our legal process. And the government says, great, we will give you certain funding to make sure that actually happens effectively. And of course, we're going to hold you to account with the money that we give you. And now Charlie's new argument is that nonprofits don't really work. It's a huge scam to make tons of money off of the taxpayer. And therefore, what's the solution now, Charlie? Is the solution now going back to the government and having the government handle this? Which was, again, when it comes to other topics like healthcare, that's socialism and Marxism. But now all of a sudden, conservative Christian nonprofits are just one big financial racket trying to soak up as much money as possible in the name of what? Toxic empathy? So once again, the propaganda we're going to see, and this is only the first week, right? It's only been 1 week, and we could be live streaming 24/7 and still not capture everything that's been going on. But what we're going to see more and more, friends, as the year goes on and the next 2 years go on, is a consistent reinvention of propaganda, not to fit truth, but to fit dogmas, right? I think that's really important, Qasim. You said that earlier, that we're not looking for objective evidence. We're not trying to go where the data leads. We have a presuppositional idea of how the world should function, of how the world is ordered, and we're going to take selective pieces of info or data to then help construct why that reality, why that dogma should be reality, despite what the actual general evidence says. And so I think it's really important as we go along this very dark time in American history that we don't get sane washed to the outrageous, right? I think one of the biggest tactics I've seen over the past few years with the Trump world and MAGA is things that used to be outlandish are now kind of just the norm. I mean, one more example, and then I'll let you go here, is watching people like Nick Fuentes, who used to be like, whoa, this guy's so radical. Now it's like, well, that's just crazy, Nick. Yeah, that's crazy, but you know, that right-wing world, man, I mean, it's just, it's wild. Or watching Elon Musk give a Nazi salute twice, and then again, watching evangelical Christians, especially media pundits, tell me, no, he was giving his heart out. We cannot allow ourselves to grow numb or cold towards the outrageous if it's outrageous.
I really want to double down on that really really beautiful point you made. I mean, that's the whole mantra, right? That this is not the government's job. This is where the church needs to fill in the gap, and the church fills in the gap. And it's like, nope, this is not the church's job either. It's basically let them suffer and die. It's such a great point. And ultimately, I always go back to, I think it's I don't know if it was actually said by Saint Francis of Assisi, but it's attributed to him, right? Preach the gospel wherever you go, when necessary, use words. And you think about here, what actions are really being exemplified here, right? If you strip away the church for a minute, if you strip away Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, for a minute, and you simply say, here's an organization that exists, and it is being approached by a significant number of refugees who are in desperate need of basic food, water, and shelter.
Right.
And the organization is giving them the middle finger. What would you call that organization? What would you say to them? You say, these are some terrible human beings. I want nothing to do with them. And so to me, that is the ultimate litmus test of any faith, of any ideology, is what is your philosophy on service to humanity? And if it is anything less than indiscriminate service to all humanity, then I'm sorry, you're in a cult. That's just the bottom line. I don't care if you agree with the person's religion, if you care if they're gay or straight. I don't care what background they have. If that is what decides whether you're going to help them or not, then you don't actually follow a faith or an ideology. You're in a cult, and you should do some deep reflecting.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Qasim Rashid, thanks for joining me. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, brother. God bless.